Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope we're live. I hope this is working. I'm sure I'll get a message very soon from the ladies from Whittlesea Council to say that yes, we are live. I'm still developing confidence in the technology, but thank you for taking some time out of your day to learn a bit more about how to work with children who have experienced trauma. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and both in Whittlesea and also here in Brisbane, the Wurundjeri Willem clan in Whittlesea, and the Yuggera and Turrbal people here in Brisbane. And we'd like to acknowledge their deep connection to land, sea and community, and also pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who join us here today. Just check the messages coming through and make sure that I am actually talking to you out there and not talking to no one. So I also wanted to thank the City of Whittlesea Early Years team for organising today's event and for all the work that they've been doing behind the scenes to make today happen. We're all trying to get our head around technology, and this is my second attempt at a webinar YouTube live stream, a Zoom webinar hybrid YouTube live stream. Yeah, we're still kind of working it out as we go, but I want to thank them for all the organising they've been doing in terms of the test runs with me and supporting the registration process. If you are interested in doing more online training through the Whittlesea Council, you can head to their website, have a look under the events tab, or you can contact council directly and ask for the early years department, and they'll give you some more information about training in the future. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what we do at Complex Care, just to provide a bit of context around we are, and I guess the framework that I'm working from. So we are messages. Why is that gone? It's working well. Okay, that's good. That's good to know. So we're a Brisbane-based counselling service, and in a nutshell, we provide intensive in-home therapy to children on child protection orders with complex support needs. So we've been operating for 12 years now around the greater Brisbane area, and three main functions of our child protection intervention work has been stabilising foster care placements at risk of breaking down. So when foster carers say, unfortunately, it's a system that's under immense stress, and typically we get engaged when foster carers say, I can't do this anymore, and we come in and work intensively with the carers and the children to keep them in that foster care home. We also support complex reunifications. There are already funded services out there who do this work. We're typically only engaged when child safety identify that children could potentially go home, but the level of risk or complexity within the family home is above the threshold of what other services are comfortable working with. So we do lots of work around complex domestic violence and intergenerational trauma. And we also do work preventing kids from coming into care. Over the last few years, we've been doing a lot more work through the NDIS as well, typically kind of crossover child protection work, as that's where our background is. All of these slides will be available to you guys. I'll send out the slides. I'll make sure that a link to the slides are available. Someone just sent through that question. It's a good one because I always forget until the end. So you don't need to screenshot them. We'll send them through. And also a link to a full day if people are interested in signing up for a full day training, online training. I'll send through the details for that and a discount for people who are registered today. So other main work that I do is around training and facilitating case clinics, basically supporting groups of stakeholders and professionals to make sense of really complex and high-risk children's behaviour. And we also do the NDIS work and do clinical assessment work as well. So that's a little bit about who we are at Complex Care. In terms of the training we're going to go through today, I'm going to be absolutely just throwing information at you over the next two hours. We will have half an hour at the end to do a bit of Q&A, and I've got the ladies from Whittlesea Council they're monitoring the live stream and the questions that you guys send through, and they're going to send it through to me in the webinar and help moderate some of those questions, so there'll be 30 minutes at the end for me to go through the questions that I haven't been able to answer already throughout the workshop. So in terms of how this training developed, I've been delivering training on this topic in different evolutions for 12 years now. And prior to starting Complex Care, most of my work was in residential care, so running group homes for children on child protection orders whose behaviour was too challenging for foster carers to manage. And prior to that, my work had started doing outreach work with mainly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids in a city called Toowoomba, about 90 minutes west of Brisbane. And my first year of work was really, probably to this day, the most rewarding work that I've done. I was, predominantly doing kind of volunteer work and also doing some counselling work and outreach work with kids, and working in an all Aboriginal school for kids who had been expelled from other programs. But all the kids had a choice about whether they engage with me or not. So I got to kind of be this mentor youth worker, kind of good time guy, and that meant that everything was relational and positive, and I got a whole lot of high fives and kids going, "Hey, have you met Trent? He's mad, he's awesome," and me going, "Yeah, I'm so good at my job," getting to feel really good and getting to feel, most importantly, really competent as a youth worker. And it wasn't long before kids started saying, "Hey man, you should come work in our resi, bro. You should come work in our resi car." I was like, "Yeah, that'll be awesome." And as a very green youth worker, and still, just finding my feet, I thought that I could instantly transition from kind of good time guy mentor into a caregiving role, into a position where they were dependent on me, and that these kids would be able to instantly discriminate between their previous caregiving experiences and me, and I was just going to nurture them, and they were going to lap it up, and it was going to be wonderful. And it was for about 24 hours before the first time a kid threatened to cave my skull in if I didn't buy him some hot chips. So it was a real shock to the system that I was completely unprepared for. And suddenly all of these relational tools, I felt so confident and competent as a youth worker. Suddenly these things weren't working within the context of this new relationship. And unfortunately for me, when I hit the ground, it was 2004. We had absolutely no understanding of trauma, at least integrated in our system. The research had been done for some time, but it certainly hadn't reached the sector I was working in. And we had nothing but simple reward and consequence systems to change behaviour. And the first resi I worked in to this day, probably the most horrific child protection histories that I've ever read. 3 of the 4 boys I was working with had been labelled in the community as serial sex offenders, and there was a lot of anger in the community, and these kids had the most horrific, complex trauma, and no framework for the people trying to work with them and make sense of it. And the reason these rewards and consequence systems were failing these kids so badly is because they're based on assumptions that aren't correct for all kids. And many of you out there, I'm sure, are still maybe quite reliant on these systems, or at least feel like the framework that's handed to you is completely focused on reward and consequence systems. And these systems only work well if two assumptions that we often believe are true are actually correct. One is that these systems assume that these kids have all the skills required to behave. Traditionally, we've viewed compliance as a simple choice, and we now know, and the neuroscience now tells us that being compliant is a skill. It requires a whole range of cognitive skills, working memory, impulse control, empathy, cognitive flexibility, language processing, social skills, perspective taking. All of these things are required for us to actually be able to comply with the expectations of others, to be able to delay our own need for gratification to meet the expectations of an adult. And we assume that these kids develop this as a function of time, and the reality is it's completely not the case. We only develop these skills with the right developmental experiences, and even then we can have delays like we can in every other skill domain. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit more and look at when we look at competence as opposed to compliance as a framework for supporting kids. The other assumption that needs to be true, that certainly wasn't true for these kids, and I'm sure isn't true for many of the kids you support, is that at their core, these kids trust adults, that they believe that adults are good and it's safe to hand over control to them. And the boys I worked with, and most of the kids, boys and girls that I've worked with over the years, if not all of them, within the child protection system, had major difficulties trusting adults and feeling safe handing over control to adults. Their template for humans is very different to kids who have had reliable, predictable caregiving, and we're going to certainly make sense of that today as well. So, I know so much of the work I was doing with kids, even though I knew I was dealing with, at its core, with pain-based behaviour. Intuitively, I knew we were dealing with pain-based behaviour. The whole system around us was saying we need to treat their behaviour as a choice, and if they do the wrong thing, then there has to be consequences. Bad things have to happen, and there was and I certainly am not saying that consequences aren't important, but with kids who've experienced trauma, it's very easy to let our need for correction to completely sabotage opportunities for connection, and that's going to be an ongoing theme as we go through today. It was about 2006 was the first time I got access to the work of Bruce Perry, Dan Hughes, Sandra Bloom, Pat Ogden, Steve Porter. There's a whole lot of people we're going to be drawing on today. So, while today I'll be giving lots of information where I've kind of put my own spin on things and found a way to break it down and make it easy to understand. Everything I'm talking about today is based on contemporary neuroscience and information that I wish I had. I wish I'd learned, in studying psychology in my undergrad, but most of the information we're going to go through, I didn't access through those means. It still isn't as readily available as it should be. And as soon as we started putting a trauma attachment based framework in place, it completely changed the outcomes we were seeing with kids, and it freed us up to do so much more important work. And we started stabilizing kids and getting them back into family-based placements. By that stage, I was running the res care programs rather than working on the floor as a youth worker. And it was in 2008 we decided we were going to go out and start taking this information to the rest of the sector, and we've been doing that ever since. So in terms of what we're going to cover in the next 2 hours, I'm going to kick off talking about stress and trauma, starting off with the basic brain anatomy, looking at the human response to threat, and then going into more detail around the neurobiology of trauma. Then we're gonna unpack another big piece of the puzzle, attachment, and look at how our early developmental experiences within a caregiving relationship shape the way that we view ourselves and the world and engage in other relationships. And then the rest of a workshop's going to be on how we support kids to develop. And we're going to start off looking at how we work with the brainstem, the lowest part of the brain, to help kids get better at regulating emotions. We're going to look at the role of mindfulness. We're going to talk briefly about competence as opposed to compliance. And then we're going to look at some important principles for facilitating attachment and building skills like empathy in children who experience maltreatment. So that's the plan. Hope that sounds good to you all. I'm still adjusting to webinar process, and I'm still not used to not having some kind of nodding faces to give me that rhythm and feedback that yes, what you're saying is making sense. You're not just rambling right now. So I hope that you're all still with me. Okay. So heads up. I'm going to be talking about some heavy stuff. Probably assume that, but I do want to let people know that we're going to be talking about things like sexual abuse, and I know many people out there have experienced trauma or have someone close to them who's experienced similar traumas. Typically, the feedback I get is this really helps them to make sense of their own experiences and what's happened to the people around them, and they have a better understanding. But it can be triggering if you need to step up, get up and walk away for a little bit and have a little pause and breather. You're welcome to do that, of course. So in terms of trauma, starting off with a broad definition, two key components. One involves a perceived threat of serious harm or death. And that could be serious harm to our physical self or serious harm to our psychological integrity, such as things like sexual abuse or severe humiliation or isolation, exile, abandonment, things like that. It could be the perceived threat of serious harm to ourselves or to someone that we're close to, someone who is sharing, someone in the same room as you, having their life threatened or taken is very likely to be traumatic to you, but particularly someone that we are emotionally connected to or are critically dependent on. The impact of domestic violence on children is constantly underestimated. Even in the last couple of years, I've had child protection practitioners say to me, "Well, I'm not sure that it would have impacted on them that much. They weren't even, present when the violence happened." And if every Friday mum sends you off down the road to Nan's before dad starts drinking, but you know that there's going to be violence, it could actually be worse for you to be down at Nan's for the next 48 hours not knowing if your mum, your primary attachment figure, the person you are critically dependent on for survival, if their life is in danger, if they are okay, then it might be to actually be in the room at that time and witnessing a 10-minute event. We constantly underestimate the impact when any threat to the person that you are dependent on for survival is perceived by our nervous system as a direct threat to ourselves. So absolutely traumatic. The second key component and a very, very important one in terms of separating, I guess, trauma from stress is that trauma is overwhelming. It overwhelms our capacity to cope. And that's really the threshold of when we move from an event. Saying an event is, wow, that sounds pretty stressful. That sounds really stressful too. Whoa, okay, that sounds traumatic. Whether it overwhelms our capacity to cope. So stress, believe it or not, is adaptive. Okay, it doesn't feel adaptive. I'm sure everyone out there watching right now has felt stressed this week, if not this morning. Okay, maybe just seeing if this YouTube live stream is actually going to work, staring at that picture saying, is this working? Okay. Whenever you feel stressed, it is a signal to your brain and body that you need to adapt. Okay. If we didn't get stressed, we wouldn't take adaptive action. We wouldn't pay bills. We wouldn't go to work. We wouldn't do all sorts of things if we weren't motivated by some kind of stressor, if we didn't do it. So stress is adaptive. It tells us we need to take action. We need to do something different. We need to approach a situation with caution. If that stress, however, moves from mild to threatening to life-threatening, okay, if that stress moves from threatening up to life-threatening now, and you no longer have any conscious strategies up here in your thinking brain to adapt to what we now perceive to be life-threatening danger, that's when our capacity is overwhelmed. Okay, that's when we reach the threshold for trauma. And that's when lower parts of the brain we're going to learn about today are forced to adapt for us. So I'll say that one more time because it's really important. If a stressor moves from threatening to life-threatening, okay, and you no longer have any conscious strategies to adapt, you no longer feel in control of your safety and well-being, and in response to life-threatening trauma, you're unable to consciously adapt to life-threatening stress. That's when we reach the threshold for trauma. That's when our capacity is overwhelmed, and that's when lower parts of the brain are forced to adapt for us. Now, we think of trauma traditionally as damaging people, as breaking people. You think of the most traumatized person you've met, person who's had the most horrific, hardest life, and seems to be the most affected by that. Maybe someone you've met in the community, or a child that you've supported, or someone within your family that you know. You think of we think of trauma as damaging people. It doesn't damage people. It helps us to adapt. Okay, but it helps us to adapt for war, not for relationships. You think of those most traumatized people, every single maladaptive behavior you see as a result of their trauma is actually incredibly adaptive if you live in chaos. Okay, it's incredibly adaptive to have a hair trigger response to stress. First sign of stress, to go straight from here to here, just ready to start swinging. It's incredibly adaptive at the first sign of stress to shut down, disconnect, fade back into the couch, and try to disappear, go numb, disconnect from your environment, dissociate. If you live in an environment where you're experiencing sustained periods of violence or exploitation on a regular basis, that will help you survive unspeakable things. Okay, incredibly adaptive to disconnect. It's incredibly adaptive to never, ever hand over control to adults. If when you've been critically dependent on them, doing this does not engage them. Okay, if when you have been frightened, when you have been hungry, when you have been cold, and you are completely dependent on someone else, on a caregiver to meet those needs, and doing this, reaching out, crying, does not cue them, does not bring them to you and get them to read your cues and respond to your needs, you will never ever want to make yourself that vulnerable again. And when you're critically dependent and you can't, and you need them, and you can't do this is ineffective, pretty soon you'll find other ways to keep your caregiver engaged, to bring them to you and get your needs met. And if you can't do this, pretty soon you're likely to start doing this, or start doing this, okay, or start doing this, whatever you got to do to pull people in. And some of you right now might be having a light bulb moment about a child who miscues you and engages you in miscuing behavior. If we get time within 2 hours, we'll come back and talk a bit about responding to miscues. But with the 2 hours we've got, we'll probably focus more on general kind of attachment behaviours and facilitating attachment. Hope that's making sense. So we're going to have a look at the brain from the bottom up, and this looks like a very complex diagram. It's one that I have of Bruce Perry's diagrams that I've pulled apart, and this upside down triangle is just showing the brain, the triune brain, over here on the right. We've got our brain stem down the bottom. We've got our limbic system in the middle, and our cortex up the top. And we can learn this the triune brain through Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. This is a really simple way of splitting up the brain into important functions in relation to our major different systems within the brain. And we're going to see the triune brain and the hand model of the brain being used more often. I'm seeing it being integrated more and more into a whole lot of different systems, including education, early education, particularly in anyone working with trauma. So I'm going to get you to humour me. I know that I can't see you, but please raise your right hand with me now and do this. Raise your right hand and solemnly swear. Okay. No. So we've got our spine here in the forearm. Okay. And brain stem here. Okay. Our reptilian brain that we share with snakes and lizards right here. And I'm going to run through the functions of each of them in a moment. Fold your thumb over. We have our limbic system, our emotional brain, our attachment system, also referred to as our mammalian brain, a part of the brain we share with mammals, with dogs and kangaroos. Fold your fingers over the top. Okay, we have a complete noggin. This is our cortex. Okay, this part of the brain here over the top. Our human brain, neocortex, neoprimate brain, it's also called. And we're going to be, this kind of creates a map of our internal and external world. We're going to be talking a lot about this part here, most importantly, the prefrontal cortex, this part of your brain right here, prefrontal cortex or prefrontal lobe, the captain of your ship, directing your attention and awareness right now. I'm going to run through each of these sections in a bit more detail. So brainstem, okay, reptile brain. This part of the brain believe is about 300 million years old. Right now, it is regulating your blood pressure, your body temperature, your heart rate, and most importantly, in terms of what we're going to focus on today, your physiological arousal state, okay, is all being dictated by your brainstem. Sorry, my dogs are just barking right now. 1 second. Sorry about that. And sorry, 1 second. Okay. Well, okay. So I'm going to have to find a way to stop him coming through the doggy door. 1 second. Okay. Yes, the dogs do need some attention. Brainstem. Okay, brainstem. We're going to talk about the dog brain in a second. First, we're going to talk about the reptile brain. So, right now, this part of your brain, your reptilian brain, is, as I said, is regulating your physiological arousal state. That means that right now, the reptilian brain, the dumbest part of our brain, is actually choosing whether you should be calm, relaxed, have your social engagement system online, be ready to relate to people and communicate, or whether you should be in an alarmed state, feeling on edge, as I was starting to feel when my dog continued to bark during the webinar, or whether you are in full-blown fight or flight, or so overwhelmed that you shut down, is all being dictated right now by our reptilian brain. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, I've got a bit more control over my brain than that, or over my state than that. But this is occurring completely below conscious awareness. Same part of your brain right now regulating your blood pressure. Is anyone out there right now consciously regulating their blood pressure? Just saying, oh, I need to bring that up a few clicks. No. And the same part of our brain is actually regulating our physiological state, whether we are calm, alarmed, full-blown fight or flight, or so overwhelmed we shut down. Now, every one of you out there, to be able to do the amazing work that you do, I had a look at the services that people are working in all sorts of different capacities in early education, or working with doing family work with vulnerable families. To be able to do the work that you do, everyone has developed ways of thinking and behaving that help you to calm down. Okay, every one of you out there knows, just before, when you're pushed to the edge, just before you swear at a child, to go, oh, and to do a regulating sigh, okay, or to grab a phone and get on the phone and someone say, you would not believe what that person just said to me. You've all worked out ways of thinking and behaving that help you to calm down. But no one gets to say, you know what, I don't feel like being anxious right now, or I don't feel like feeling angry and out of control. Let's just flick us back to calm. Wonderful if we could, but that's not the case. And it's really important we understand that with children, because we often assume that they are consciously choosing their physiological state. And what I'm telling you is that no one is, that no one gets to choose what state they're in, and being able to self-regulate, to calm yourself down, to monitor and modify your internal state, is actually a skill that we only develop with the right practice and developmental experiences. So that's our brainstem in a nutshell. Moving up to our limbic system, our mammalian brain that we share with dogs and dolphins, okay, and kangaroos. This is our emotional brain. It's also our attachment system. Reptiles don't need this part of the brain. They don't need an attachment system. Have a think for a second. What happens when baby turtles hatch? What do they do? Where do they go? Yep, straight up the beach to the mother turtle, who rolls onto her back and begins breastfeeding all her baby turtles. No? Confused a few of you, I'm sure. No, straight down the beach, out into the ocean, and off they go, completely independent, without even coming into contact with their caregiver. We are not those animals. We are on the opposite end of the spectrum. We are born incredibly dependent due to the large size of our cortexes and skulls. We need to be born incredibly developmentally immature. Most other mammals, I should say, reach a stage of adult independence about 12 months of age. Not us humans. I have a 3-year-old upstairs. I'm sure he'll probably try to interrupt at some point as well. Who 3 years he's been on this earth. He should be, compared to other animals, he should be cooking by now. But if I was to take him out into the wilderness, place him on the ground, and say, "Off you go. You're on your own," and walk away, what would happen? I'd like to think he'd be raised by koalas, but the reality is he would die. And for that reason, humans, we have some very, very powerful instincts built into this system that say stay with your caregiver if you want to survive. And if you feel threatened, go to your caregiver. And typically these attachment instincts work very well in conjunction with these instincts down here to get away from danger. But we're going to talk about what happens when they get pushed into competition, when we have certain caregiving experiences a bit later when we look at disorganized attachment. As I said, fold our fingers over the top. We've got our cortex, our thinking brain over the top, and this part here, the captain of your ship, the prefrontal cortex, is where we really want to focus our attention. This is the part of your brain that is actually focusing your attention right now, where you hold information and manipulate it, plan out your day, execute tasks. Whenever you think a conscious thought, or you're consciously aware of something, you notice what you're feeling, or you have a thought, or all of that is occurring here in the prefrontal lobe. It's connected to a whole lot of other systems. This really is responsible for conscious awareness. And if you make the hand with me again, you might notice But these two fingers here in the middle, the two fingernails right here, which we would call the medial or middle prefrontal cortex, is the only part of our upstairs smart thinking brain that's actually touching both our emotional and survival brain, depending on the shape of your hand. If you have freakishly long fingers, it might not work for you. The only part of our upstairs thinking brain that's actually touching these two lower systems is this part here, the medial prefrontal cortex. And it's part of the brain responsible for introspection, and part of the brain where we can strengthen these connections. It keeps our smart brain linked. It's the only part of our smart brain that is linked to our emotional and survival. And when we're calm, it's relatively well integrated. But when we get stressed, it tends to do this. Oh, and we flip our lid. Okay, and suddenly our smart brain, our prefrontal cortex, becomes disconnected from our emotional and our survival brains, and they get to run wild. Okay. Now, some of you thinking, I'd feel that if my cortex was tearing back in my skull. It doesn't actually flick back. What does happen is blood flow rushes, cortical blood flow rushes from our smart brain down to the back of the brain, down to our survival brain, and we lose and gain some important functions, which I'll talk about in a moment. Fight or flight response. What is it all about? One more for good luck. We don't know if the lion had low self-esteem, or whether the pig was just feeling extra confident. But important thing is the pig didn't wake up that morning ready to take on a lion. Its brain and body temporarily adapted to respond. And we're going to have a look at how that response is initiated, and then have a look at what happens to the brain under conditions of threat when in a hyperaroused state. So all incoming information, all sensory information coming into our brain actually passes through the lower parts of the brain first, comes in through the thalamus. Right now, if someone snuck into the room where you were, snuck up behind you and grabbed a door and slammed it as hard as they could, bang, behind you, right? What do you think about what would happen? Soon as that loud, unexpected noise, that sensory information hit your thalamus, okay, we would see two circuits become engaged. Two brain circuits would become active. When it hit the thalamus, we would see one very quickly. The amygdala instantly would be stimulated, and you would do a little jump. Okay, you get a little bit of a fright, little startle response. You would move into a mobilized freeze response, most likely, where suddenly you were ready, your body was ready to move, you're in an activated state, you're highly alert, but you're not going to run straight away, because it's not the safest thing to do. When under a threatening situation, you're going to assess whether you should be still, or whether you should take off, or whether you need to fight. A split second later, actually 0.3 of a second later, your cortex would also be stimulated, and that information travels up to your smart brain to be consciously interpreted. So you hear a bang, body responds, and then your thinking brain says, oh, it's just a door slamming. Suddenly you might, if there'd been a bit of a draft, you might jump and then not even bother turning around, because your thinking brain has caught up with your emotional brain. This is really important to understand, because we like to think that our brain is this kind of congruent cohesive kind of unit, that everything I do is because my brain has decided. But I want you to imagine that instead of doing this training with me right now, instead, you know, we'll take it a step further. Instead, you were watching a horror movie, and you've got, you know, your room nice and dark, and as with all kind of ridiculous horror movies, the characters have decided to split up and go down into the basement to investigate some creepy sound. And all this, you're getting all this feedback that something bad is going to happen, something really scary is about to happen. You're like, don't go in there, come on, don't go in there. Music is getting scarier and scarier, and then that door blows shut behind you, bang. Are we going to see the same response that we talked about before? Are we going to see something much bigger? We're likely to see something much bigger, but what has actually changed? The door slam was the same, and you might say, well, the environment's changed, but we're not responding because we say, well, I'm watching a horror movie, it's probably more appropriate for me to dive through the window than it is just to turn around quickly. What we're seeing is that our brainstem, that reptilian brain I talked about, is not smart enough. It's not smart enough to actually assess whether a danger is real, and our amygdala is getting all of this input that there is something bad about to happen, and our reptile brain says, okay, well, let's move us into an alarmed state, a state of physiological readiness where we're mobilized and ready to move. And that same loud noise that before moved us into an alarm state now moves us into full-blown fight or flight, where we're ready to go. And again, this is so important to understand, because we like to think that we have conscious control over it. But what's really important to understand is that whenever you see an overreaction in another person, it's actually a reflection of their physiological state, their stress, or how they perceive the environment. And that's really important to know, kind of going through the world, and particularly interacting with people who have experienced trauma. Whenever you see an overreaction to a minor stressor, it is a reflection of their physiological state in that moment, that their brain has pushed them into an alarm state. Maybe because of they're in a hypervigilant state due to constant trauma in their life, that's where their new baseline is. It might be sensory integration issues from autism, or it could be just cumulative stress. They've got so much going on that now they can't handle the traffic jam they're in. Either way, we don't consciously choose our physiological state. And this is not about excusing behavior. At the end of the day, we still, I always promote that it's your responsibility, but it's good to understand why we're reacting the way that we do. I want to talk about the fight or flight response and hyperarousal. What actually happens when we go into fight or flight, when our lid flips? If we had more time, I would talk through everything that happens to the body. But today we're going to focus just on what's happening to our brain. In a nutshell, the brain becomes geared towards action, not thinking. Okay, we move from social engagement, relationship, to survival, and so many processes that are really, really important when relating to people, when excuse me, in a safe community, are not terribly useful or adaptive when under threat. So blood rushes away from our brain, particularly the left prefrontal cortex, and the first thing that goes out the window is language, and we lose our capacity to communicate. Language disappears. Anyone out there who's ever had a run-in, maybe as a child yourself, with a teacher, or maybe with an employer at some point, who suddenly shouted, "Why did you do that?" And you're like, and it's gone, and then you walk away or drive off, and 5 minutes later you're like, Why didn't I say that? Why didn't I say that? I had very good reasons for everything I did. Why couldn't I access it in that moment? Because language is a relational function. Okay, it doesn't serve us. Uh, um, Past and future thinking are also really important things when we're safe and we're calm, that don't serve us, that aren't important, or the most useful processes when under threat. And many of us think, well, I wish I could think really well about past and future when under stress, and it feels like it would be adaptive to be able to talk well when under stress. You've got to remember what our biology has evolved for, not a class of kids who are stressing us out. It's evolved for that saber-toothed tiger, and if a lion suddenly wandered into the room right now, first of all, my dog would take care of it. But if a lion was to enter the room right now and look me up and down, do I want to be using my language brain and engaging this guy in a dialogue and having a conversation with the lion? Do I want to be using my past future brain and thinking back to that David Attenborough documentary I saw on lions 3 months ago, and starting to come up with a complex plan about how I'm going to engage this guy? Or do I want to scan his non-verbal cues, okay, of this lion and make an instant, automatic, reactive decision, reflexive decision to either freeze or run as fast as I can? So some processes that are wonderful when you're calm are certainly not terribly helpful when under threat. Anyone who's ever had, in terms of that past future thinking, anyone who's ever had a passionate argument with a loved one where you flipped your lid, okay, I'm sure you're out there. I know you're out there. You may notice that as soon as you flip your lid, okay, you can't remember anything nice about this person, okay, despite the fact that you're in a loving relationship. It's gone in that moment. You can only think about things that they've done to annoy you, and you stop thinking about the future once that lid has flipped. You're no longer thinking about the consequences of the things that we're saying. We're just focused on self-protection. We're in a kind of automatic, reactive, defensive state. And 10 minutes later, that lid comes back down, and we're suddenly saying, wow, how did I hate you so much in that moment? And why did I say that? I'm gonna pay for that for a while. Empathy. We're going to talk about empathy a bit later. Empathy is a skill. It's a skill. Humans aren't born with it. This is a really important one. We only develop it if we get mirroring. We have the right developmental experiences. And there's a huge research base to show that humans are not born with empathy. We're born with a special band of motor neurons called mirror neurons that are responsible for empathy, that are run along here across the frontal lobe. But we are not born with empathy, and our compassion circuitry switches off when under stress. Okay. Empathy switches off when we feel threatened. Okay. The last thing, and this is has some biological kind of evolutionary functions as well. The last thing we wanted to do when we were in the middle of a war, and we were fighting a neighboring tribe we were going into battle with, the last thing we wanted to do is hit or throw a spear at someone and go, oh, that would have hurt. And are you okay? We're designed under threat to disconnect, which is also why when you flip your lid with a loved one, the last thing that you're going to say in the middle of a heated argument is, oh, you're right, that makes sense. That must have been really, really hard for you. We're unable to connect with someone else's emotional experience in the moment. We tend to disengage. We're unable to resonate in an emotional way, maybe cognitively, but in an emotional way, until we're calm, and then we go, you know what, that would have actually makes sense why you were feeling that way when we're calm or relaxed. Important to understand if you are working with a child who is under stress, that their capacity for empathy is limited. And we're going to talk a bit about an important process for developing empathy. in a bit. And just to demonstrate how powerful the fight or flight response and useful it can be. Beautiful for survival, terrible for relationships. That's what this response is. It's really important to know that when we're in that state, we're not listening. If you are supporting a child who is in a fight or flight state, they're not listening to what you're saying, but they are incredibly attuned to how you're saying it. And many of us have been taught that when the worse a child is behaving, the more serious the more serious or angry we need to be. We come in and we bring this voice, and it's based on basic principles of operant conditioning. The worse your behaviour, the scarier I will be, and you will associate what you're doing with me being scary and saying, "Hey, what are you doing?" And it's wonderful for building powerful associations, but unfortunately, the moment that you look remotely stressed, their lid is going to flip, and if they're already in an escalated state, it's going to make it harder for them to connect with you. It's going to make it much harder for them to hear what you're saying. So yes, if you look scary, they're going to make some connections, but it's all going to be down here in their reptilian brain. And you can teach a lizard to be scared of you, but you can't teach it much more. This is really important to understand. If you want a child to learn in that moment, you want to teach them something, you need to be calm. Okay, we know historically from some very medieval kind of teaching methods that we still saw in the last century, that whacking a kid over the back of the head when they get their times tables wrong does not support their learning, and raising your voice does not help kids to learn. And the craziest part is, one of the things we often use our serious, angry voice with kids is around, how do you think he feels when you do that? And the moment that you take that voice and that face, okay, the child can no longer actually resonate with the emotions of someone else. If you want their compassion circuitry online, we need to be calm and relaxed, and that's when the best learning occurs. And you can be calm and relaxed even when you're giving a child consequences. In fact, it completely changes the way that they interpret them. But we're going to come back to this model. I know right now it probably sounds a little bit counterintuitive, the idea of being playful and curious when a child is doing the wrong thing, but it'll make a bit more sense when we come back to it. So that's a fight or flight response. I want to talk quickly about the freeze response, and how freeze could be adaptive. Oh. So I'm going to talk about the freeze response quite quickly. It's important for people to understand that this is our last line of defence when fight or flight is not able to get us out of harm's way. And this is a response that's typically engaged under conditions of trauma. Fight or flight is a wonderful defensive response if you are able to actually escape the threat. Not terribly helpful though if the threat is neglect. If you've been left in a cot with critical needs unmet all day, because your parents are scamming and scoring ice, you can only stay in that fight or flight state for so long before you perceive abandonment and your system starts to shut down, and you dissociate, you disconnect from what's happening around you. Fight or flight will not help you if you're experiencing sexual abuse, and there is a huge power differential, and you're unable to get away. Shutting down and disconnecting from your experience, dissociating, attempting to psychologically escape when there is no escape, and directing your awareness away from what's happening in your body or happening to your body, becomes a really, really powerful way to survive on unspeakable things. And fight or flight is not going to help you if you're experiencing sustained periods of violence, or if you know that if you run away, when you come back, the violence is going to be twice as bad. Dissociation becomes a very, very powerful tool. And that left brain of ours that shrinks when we're in fight or flight completely switches off, so that we are no longer consciously aware of what's happening to us, attempt to psychologically escape when there is no escape. And our body is typically, when in fight or flight, is in a hyper-aroused state, okay, our heart going crazy, lungs going crazy, shifts from hyper-arousal down to hypo-arousal, down below our normal state. We move into this hibernative-like state, where you know, our everything is slowing down. Our autonomic nervous system slows right down. Our digestion is completely switched off. Our blood pressure drops, so that if we experience injury, we don't bleed out. And our body releases a whole range of different analgesic endorphins, different opiates and cannabinoids, to reduce our experience of pain, and we can experience complete anesthesia or analgesia, go completely numb, or at least numb in terms of pain as a result. And essentially what our brain is trying to do is disconnect, play dead, submit, and hope for the best, and worst case scenario, ease us into death as gently as possible. This is a horrific state to be in, and I've worked with young people who have been in this state over and over and over again, particularly when they've experienced trauma in the first year of life. The most dissociative children that I have worked with, and teenagers I've worked with, have typically experienced chronic sexual abuse, violence that equates to torture, or really, really severe early neglect. And often will describe feeling, when experiencing dissociation or hypoarousal, they'll describe not recognizing themselves in the mirror, this sense of disconnection from self. They'll describe feeling numb, often feeling dead inside, particularly in this area of the body. We'll see and them being motivated, you know, feeling to feel dead is you know, I can only imagine is the most horrific state to be in. They'll often talk about feeling like their conscious thought has been muted. They're just in this spaced out zone where they can lose time, and will be motivated to do anything to self-regulate that experience, to gain mastery over that dissociative feeling. And that includes self-harming. Some learn that they cut into themselves, or damaging their body can give them this sense of cool clarity, where they come back into their body and feel alive again. And certainly motivates drug use and all sorts of risk-taking behaviours as a way of trying to self-regulate a horrific experience. So I want to talk about how trauma changes the brain, and talk about complex trauma before we move into attachment. When we experience life-threatening danger, that we're unable to respond to. As I said earlier, our brain adapts. If you're unable to respond and adapt to life-threatening danger, our lower parts of our brain start to adapt for us, and they do that by encoding patterns of sensory information with danger. So if you were going for a walk one afternoon and you were attacked by a dog came running out of a yard and attacked you, we would find that it's likely, if you weren't able to adapt to that situation and you reached a threshold for trauma, you didn't feel like you could consciously adapt and you were overpowered or overwhelmed, we will see that there are patterns of information and associations made in lower parts of the brain in response to that. So we might find that the brainstem in particular, and also within the amygdala, that that particular type of dog, let's say it was a German Shepherd, might become associated with future danger. And if it happened a second time with another dog, you might find that all dogs become associated with danger. Now, what's really important is that it's the lower part of our brain that does most of that makes all of these really generalized associations. Up here in your thinking brain, after that event, you might associate that particular dog with danger. That particular dog 3 doors down, and that dog may be sent off to a farm and you might never ever see it again. So you might feel that you're safe. But your brainstem in response to it tries to adapt, and it says, we need to avoid all German Shepherds. And later, when you see a friend's German Shepherd that you know is a beautiful dog, you might feel panicked. You might feel out of control or even dissociative if you sustained fairly serious harm as a result of that. I saw a question has come through around, can this affect memory or blocking it out? It most certainly can. If we had more time, I would talk to that a little bit more. But when we dissociate, just going back to dissociation, I think is what the question was about. Yes, dissociation is impacts on how we encode memory during that time, and it also feeds into why we have post-traumatic flashbacks. I'm going to talk to it really quickly and then come back to trauma, because it's important when someone has expressed an interest in it. Typically, when we remember things, we remember things in a very integrated way. Our left and our right brain encode information. Our left brain creates a language-based narrative for an event, and our right brain creates a sensory and emotional story. So if I said to you what happened this morning, you would probably have a language-based chronological story. You could tell me, I got up and then I went and did this, and then I went and did this. And as you walked through that story, you would have some right brain emotional and sensory memories attached to it. You might remember what you ate for breakfast, or the taste of your coffee that was amazing, or a joke you heard on the radio. Okay. Left brain language-based story, right brain images, sounds, smells, and emotions. In cases where like things like sexual abuse, where we're so overwhelmed that we dissociate, the left part of the brain is offline, so that we don't have to pay conscious attention to what's happening to us. But our right brain often stays online, waiting for the right opportunity to get up or get away. Same with if you were attacked by a bear, left brain would switch off. You would completely disconnect from what's happening, but part of your brain would stay online, waiting to see if the bear got scared off. Otherwise, we would just lie there and bleed out. So the right brain is still encoding sensory information. In the case of things like sexual abuse, that means that images, sounds, smells, even physical pain, along with all of those horrific emotions, terror, shame, disgust, can all be encoded without a language-based conscious narrative. Which means that after the event, maybe 2 weeks later, 6 months later, or 10 years later, if something in our environment triggers that memory system, instead of experiencing this story, this integrated left and right brain memory, this story with emotional and sensory memories about what happened to me 10 years ago. Instead, I'm just suddenly hit with these intrusive re-experiencing emotions and fragmented images and sounds and smells, as if it's happening when? Right now in this moment. And what we're talking about is a post-traumatic flashback. So yes, most definitely dissociation plays a role in post-traumatic amnesia. And one of the things that often happens with these kind of intrusive traumatic memories is that reliving the most horrific thing that's ever happened to you as if it's happening in real time is almost as big as that initial trauma itself for many people. And I've worked with kids who have disclosed and watched them sweating and shaking. It's horrible. It's horrible. And that can motivate us to work very hard to not think about that particular event again. And actively try to push any kind of conscious recollection of that experience, which also contributes to a loss of memory around that event through ongoing avoidance of triggering memories as well. Hope that makes sense. Went on a bit of a tangent there with that question. Back to trauma though. So our brain helps us to adapt by making associations in the brain, okay, and associating more and more things with being dangerous. And I gave an example of dogs, and that we could want to pat a dog up here in our thinking brain, but below conscious awareness, as we go to approach that dog, we suddenly feel panicked and we might have trouble making sense of it because our brainstem is trying to protect us. Your brainstem does not give a damn about your plans, okay? It doesn't care about the fact that you want to engage in education, doesn't care about the fact that you want to go and visit certain people or that you want to go to your job. It cares about protecting you. And it wants you, whenever it sees you as being vulnerable, it wants to protect you and help you survive. Now, our response would make sense again if from a biological perspective, if you were out in the wilderness with your hunting party and you were set upon by a bear. It would make sense if someone was seriously mauled that for the next 4 weeks you felt really anxious, and whenever you relaxed and lay down to go to sleep, you had intrusive memories of bear. Your brain would say, bear, hey, have you thought about bear? When you went to pray or try to go to sleep, whenever you saw one of any kind of animal in the peripheral vision, a cow, the first thing your brain said was, bear, is that a bear? That's incredibly adaptive in terms of survival, to constantly think and be preoccupied and have intrusive thoughts about the threat. That's super adaptive. However, if you are returning from war and back in a safe civilian environment, and every time a car backfires or anytime someone raises their voice, or your kids scream out from the trampoline because they're having so much fun, that the first thing you think of, your brain prepares for, is life-threatening danger, ready to combat, and you go into an extreme state of fight, flight, rage. Suddenly, this becomes very maladaptive, and we can see similar things happening for the children that you're supporting. So, in terms of complex trauma and the kids we're supporting, the source of danger might start off with this guy here, mum's new boyfriend, who's just moved in, and this guy has experienced horrific trauma in his early development and has in no way healed from it. He's missed out on foundational experiences for self-regulation, has poor impulse control, low empathy, and had been powerless most of his life, including the 5 years he experienced recently in prison, where he was violently assaulted on a regular basis, and he now finds it exhilarating to have power over others, low empathy, poor impulse control. Not a good combination. You don't want to bump into this guy in the street. You certainly don't want to be living with him, and you most definitely do not want to be critically dependent on him for your survival at times, being left in his care. And at first, we're going to see some pretty powerful associations made in the brain. The second that this guy comes into proximity, they hear his voice, the amygdala is going to be stimulated, and we're going to see these kids moving into fight or flight or freeze-like states. But if we keep being exposed to trauma over and over again, to threats with him, the brain is forced to adapt. And this is the other thing. Our brain is designed for those kind of traumas I talked about, violent clashes with a neighbouring tribe we're at war with, or coming into contact with a predatory animal. Our brain was designed, our neurobiology is designed to live in a safe house, in a safe village, come into contact with a threat, and followed by long periods of recovery. Our brain was never designed to live with complex relational trauma. It's never designed to live with a threat. And when you live with a threat, our brain is forced to have to keep trying to adapt over and over and over again. So what might start off with just this guy, after a while, the brain saying, we've got to get better at adapting. You're still experiencing violence. We've got to respond quicker. We've got to react faster. We might see pretty soon that times become associated with danger. Maybe 4 in the afternoon is when this guy comes home from work and is ready to lose it. Or maybe 3 in the morning is when mum gets kicked out of the pub, comes home blind drunk, out of control, experiencing overwhelming shame that she's blown all the money. And these kids, they do not have to look at the clock. Okay, 5 to 3 in the morning, they are sitting up in bed. Their little body clocks are tuned in. They're sitting up in bed, adrenaline spitting out before mum even gets her keys in the front door. Their bodies are becoming used to it. Their nervous system and brainstem is anticipating. And you know, the amount of foster carers I work with who will attest to the fact that the child is still, you know, gets anxious or angry or revved up at the same time every single day, long after they have left the family of origin or the place of trauma. Places become associated with danger. What I've dealt with so many times in resi or foster carers, where bedrooms or bathrooms become associated with trauma when kids are experiencing sexual abuse, particularly chronic sexual abuse. Now, at times I work with carers, they said, Trent, they've been here 5 years. They know their bedroom is safe. And I say, you're 100% correct. They do. Up here, they know that their bedroom is safe. Unfortunately, down here, their brainstem, every time they go in there, into that room and go to switch off the light, their brainstem says, this is not safe. This is not safe. And if you don't have a framework for making sense of it, this is an area you're likely to get into a power struggle if you don't understand trauma. And you know, I didn't have this framework when I first started going in working in residential care. I didn't have the framework, and you know, it was explicitly, even though I knew we were dealing with pain-based behaviours, and one program I worked in, it was explicitly communicated to me that the child's behaviour was a reflection of my competence as a worker, and if they didn't follow the routines, that it was a reflection that they didn't respect your authority. We were being set up for horrible power struggles with these kids, and you know, I remember having a really wonderful day with a kid, and end of the day, it's time to go to bed, and I tuck them in. I go to switch off the light, and suddenly they swear at me, and I go, turn the light back on. I go, okay, I'll turn the light on. You can have the light on if you want. They're like, no, I'm not going to sleep. And they start turning the music up, and another kid's now kicking on the wall saying, turn that off. And I go, come on, mate, you know the deal. It's time to go to bed. No, you can't make me go to bed. F off. And they start to escalate with me. And if you don't have a framework, that's when you get into power struggle. Go, hey, mate, you know the rules. If you don't want to go to bed, well, maybe you won't be going in the pool tomorrow. Oh, is that right, Trent? Is that right? And then this kid suddenly runs down the corridor in his pajamas, runs out the back door and dives into the swimming pool and says, "Now, Trent, hey, what you gonna do now, Trent, hey?" And me, who is diving headfirst into a power struggle now, says, "Well, if you don't get out of the pool right now, this is going to happen. I'll put that PlayStation in the cupboard." And I'm now focusing on the violation of the violation. I can't even remember what my original expectation was. It was to go to sleep. I'm now trying to get him to comply with my consequence, or my consequence. Not even part of my brain is thinking. This kid was sexually abused by his father. Not even part of my brain is thinking. When this kid goes to put his head down, and the same with when the kids, you've got kids who are struggling with napping. When we go to lie down and put our head on a pillow, that's when we're faced with all the things we don't want to think about. And these kids can have so much that's on their plate. So much on their plate that they don't want to think about. The fact that no one wants them. The fact that mum can't show up to family contact once a month. That's what they're thinking about, and we're thinking that they don't respect us because they're giving us attitude in that moment, and that's certainly not the reality. It's never about us. It's a reflection of their physiological state in that moment. As soon as I had a framework of competence and connection, rather than correction, rather than trying to coerce the kids into doing what I wanted them to, we just focused on making them feel connected and safe, focused on meeting their developmental needs, which often meant, making sure they had night lights. It meant giving them head massages before bed, or sitting in their door frame and reading them the story, even though they told us they didn't want to originally. Just going, please let me, playfully harassing them until these badass teenage boys would eventually let me read Harry Potter. And meet their developmental needs. That's when we saw these kids were calming down. After a while, after experiencing this trauma for long enough, our brain's trying so hard to adapt that we can, even the first signs of stress can start to initiate a fight-flight response. This is a pretty mild-looking facial expression. I've worked with plenty of kids and parents who the first sign of stress, the moment that they see the narrowing of the eyes, okay, this could be our default expression with some of the kids we might be working with, okay, pretty mild facial expression there, cranky, could even be short-sighted, okay. The moment they see the narrowing of their eyes, their brainstem says, this person is approximating distance for violence. This is always followed by this, and if you don't, and I worked with kids who have had some of their biggest meltdowns. The teacher, with one kid who the teacher was trying to read something he'd scribbled on a piece of paper, trying to work out whether it was a word or not. Standing over him, a teacher he had a really safe, positive relationship with, and this little kid lost it and tore the room apart and sent the whole area into the whole couple of classrooms into lockdown around it, based on a look, due to his past trauma. So it's really, really important that we understand that the brainstem could be interpreting so much of what we do within the context of violence. Raising your hand, if I did this, you'd probably think I was about to throw a question out to you. Some of the kids we work with, the moment they see this, their brain says, I'm about to get hit. I know I'm in quite a challenge, a kind of so far, but it does get worse. Eventually the brain can say, you know what, it's no longer safe to be calm. This whole calm thing is not working for us. We keep taking off our armor every day when we go into the classroom, only to experience violence when we get home again. Sometimes this can shift really, really quickly, where our baseline state moves from calm up to alarmed, This is where we wake up like this, in an anxious, vigilant state. We will, when in this vigilant state, we will interpret neutral facial expressions as threatening. Okay, we will, if you're not clearly indicating that you are safe and happy, I will assume that you are dangerous. My ears are no longer focusing on the sounds of human speech. They're focused on low frequency sounds associated with footfall, growling, and danger. That becomes I become preoccupied with scanning my environment for threat, not relating to people. And that has huge implications. I want you to have a look at this picture and imagine this little kid sitting up in front of the class is in a anxious, vigilant state. This classroom that looks pretty relaxed and enriched is potentially being interpreted very differently. I hope you're all getting the Jaws music coming through. So when in that state, a child laughing at the back of the classroom is laughing at him. The teacher raising his voice slightly to get the attention of another child at the back of the room is suddenly about to hurt him. And when the teacher says it's time to get up and do show and tell, his capacity is completely overwhelmed. He's likely to take that flip chart out on the way out the door, or completely freeze up and shut down. Really important that we recognise that no one else can hear that Jaws music. No one else can hear that Jaws music in that moment. And when we look around, we've got this nice, relaxed environment. And 3 weeks ago, this kid was able to do show and tell. So why can't he do it today? He mustn't. He just mustn't feel like it. He just doesn't want to. Just being naughty. He's just being naughty, being a little shit. Just wants to have things his way. What we don't realise is that 3 weeks ago he was still seeing mum every week, and 2 weeks ago she showed up with a black eye, and child safety say this week that they can't get in contact with her. Oh well, she goes AWOL all the time. She disappears. In his little mind, best case scenario, he's been abandoned again. Worst case scenario, she's dead. And I've just got a message that there was no music. Okay, so that wouldn't have made a lot of sense to you. This is something for me to be aware of for future webinars. There was Jaws music going at one stage that was getting louder, so hopefully hopefully you got the gist of what I was trying to communicate there. Attachment. I've got to move quite quickly because, as usual, I'm a bit behind. So we'll go a little bit into our question time. But I did go off on a bit of a tangent to answer a question already. So that's trauma in a nutshell. We're going to jump straight into attachment. Attachment is one of the most important properties of humankind, and the last thing I want to do is take the love out of it and just silence it all away. But the reason attachment is so important to us is our critical dependence on our caregivers for survival. That's the reason that attachment is so important to us as humans. Is our critical dependence, as I talked about before, that animals on the other end of the spectrum pop out, scurry off, and they're ready. They can live out their lives. We are not those animals at all. We are so dependent and vulnerable. And in a healthy, secure attachment, we experience reliable, predictable, responsive caregiving, and the relationship brings a sense of soothing safety and comfort and pleasure. And the loss or threat of losing an attachment figure should evoke distress. Have a look now, and you let me know if were we getting sound there on that video? Someone just send me through a comment, and there's a bit of a delay. No, you're not. Okay. I will narrate this video instead. So what we're seeing is something called the strange situation. And this is an attachment experiment that started with the lady Mary Ainsworth back in the 60s. And the experiment involves a series of separations and reunions. So basically we place a parent and their baby in a room they've never been in before, and look at what happens first when a stranger enters. So the baby ran to mum when the stranger came in, and slowly becomes a bit more comfortable, using mum as a secure base to navigate. And in a moment, they're going to send the mum out of the room and activate this separation anxiety or instinct, this attachment instinct. And the baby right now it's having a real cry. They only get the mum out for a minute, and then send her straight back in. It's actually the reunion that tells us the most about the child's attachment. So we look at how they use them as a base, but it's about what happens during the reunion that tells us the most about the child's attachment experience. And the baby has already stopped crying. Mum's only just gone for a little bit. The baby calms down quite quickly, and mum is able to soothe and direct the baby's attention away from their distress, and that is what we see in a secure attachment, but certainly not what happens in all attachment experiences. So 60% of the population across all cultures, we'll see generally, will have a secure attachment where the child has had reliable, predictable, responsive caregiving. And in that clip, we saw when the stranger entered the room, baby went to mum. When mum left, baby got distressed. And when mum walked back in, baby went straight to mum and did this, directly cued mum. And baby stopped crying before mum even got her other foot in the door. Okay, he is so confident. He's almost cocky, isn't he? That he knows that she's going to pick him up. He knows when he does this, she's going to pick him up. And that confidence comes from reliable, predictable responses from mum in the past. Mum has been a reliable, predictable caregiver. He knows whenever he is hungry, scared, overwhelmed, soiled, too hot, too cold, whenever he has a critical need, he cries and reaches out, and pretty soon someone will come to him, pick him up, read his cues, and meet his needs. Okay, that is where secure attachment comes from. When we're critically dependent on others and they respond to our cues, we feel confident that our needs will be met in relationships. We learn that we can trust others and depend on others and feel comfortable doing it. And we also develop the confidence to use them as a base to go out into the world. And some of you will be familiar with the Circle of Security program. You start off with a very small circle as a baby. The baby stays very close to us, and slowly they start to navigate further and further away from us. That circle gets bigger, and might be off to kindy, off to school. Eventually, that circle may get really good. In Zoom setting, I need to select share your computer sound. Okay, let's see if I can do that. I might have to try that next time. I'll see if I can get it up. I'll see if it happens in, I'll just check under screen sharing as well. Share computer sound, cool, okay. Thank you, that was from Steve Stokes. Yeah, thanks, Steve, for why you'll be able to hear the rest of the videos. Thanks, Steve. Okay, that's a secure attachment. What do you think would happen in that same video we watched if in the past the parent, that you know, it could be mum or dad, but in this one we had a mum and a baby. If in the past sometimes when the baby reached out, mum was able to meet their needs, but sometimes she was triggered and overwhelmed and said, I can't do this right now. And half the time reaching out engaged the caregiver to pick them up and meet their needs, but half the time it didn't. What do you think might happen in that situation? I want you to have a little think for a moment. During the reunion, what do you think the baby might do? What we probably see is that when the mum came back into the room, the baby would still navigate towards the parent and still reach out. And of course, a parent who is in a strange situation, participating in an experiment, is not preoccupied with their own stresses, is focused on exactly what they need to do in that moment, and will pick the baby up and hold them. But what we'll see is that the baby will often remain distressed because the baby had no idea whether the parent was going to pick them up or not. And we see that they are resistant. Sometimes they'll even push away at the parent, but they won't engage. They'll appear angry. They won't engage with the parent's efforts to calm the child down because they had no idea whether they were going to pick them up in the first place. We call this anxious, resistant, or ambivalent attachment. Develops from having unreliable or unpredictable caregiving. Caregiver who is inconsistent in the way that they respond to us, and often with a parent who is overwhelmed or experiencing stress. This also can happen with a mum who is very focused on trying to meet her child's needs, but in a domestic violence relationship with a partner who is triggered when they give attention to the child, who is triggered when the focus is away from them. And many perpetrators of domestic violence, particularly ones who are preoccupied with abandonment and control, actually have an anxious, resistant, or ambivalent attachment style themselves. And often later in adult life, we will call this a preoccupied attachment style, where they feel like they can't trust others. They believe that they're not really worthy of love and care, and other people can't be trusted. And if they don't have, if they're not self-aware and are low in empathy and impulse control, this is a kind of a perfect recipe for someone who is going to engage in coercive, controlling behaviours of anyone that they are close to, because they feel so vulnerable in their relationships. And a mother who might not be preoccupied herself and be trying to meet the child's needs may also be, when in a domestic violence relationship, be impaired in her ability to be reliable and predictable in the caregiving if there is someone who is threatening them or making them feel unsafe, or threatening to punish them and the child if they engage them when the child needs them, which can also result in the child having an ambivalent attachment to their primary attachment figure, if it is the mum in that particular case. Hope that makes sense. So if we have unpredictable, unreliable caregiving, we learn that we can't really trust people. We often become more preoccupied with staying close to our attachment figure. I can get my needs met, but not in a reliable way. And we'll feel a need to be in control, to find other ways to get in control of our caregiver and to keep them close. Kids with ambivalent attachment styles that can have a need for control. That might be kids who stay in proximity seeking. You know, those kids where you come out of the toilet and they're there on the door waiting for you. That could also just be anxiety, because when we're anxious, it says, hey, go to your caregiver. It might not necessarily be a reflection of their attachment style. It could just be that they feel under threat or anxious. Or it could be the coercive control, or a child who constantly pushing your buttons as a way to pull you in without making themselves vulnerable and miscue you. What do you think might happen in that situation if every time the child reached out, the person said, "No, you're okay," and pushed them away? We would probably see an avoidant attachment develop. So I've got a video here of ambivalent attachment. We'll just watch this first, and hopefully the sound will be shared now.
Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure, but you'll see we get a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
Anxious avoidant attachment. Sound is working. Yay. Anxious avoidant attachment develops from having unresponsive caregiving. Parents who are deliberately delaying their or not responding to our cues around critical needs, and this is in terms of lasting kind of attachment factors. It's typically when people aren't responding to our emotions that we see the biggest impact. There are lots of children who have avoidant attachment experiences in relation to other facets of their development or other expressed needs that may have less impact as long as their needs are actually being met. So what I'm saying is that we are in our modern society, we have more and more mainstream parenting practices that involve not responding to a child's cues, and we have more and more mainstream parenting practices that based on the stresses placed on households and caregivers, where we try to separate the child from mum, who is essentially their ecosystem, and get them over here functioning over here independently as quick as possible. And the research is still fairly early in terms of what's emerging, but certainly it can start to set children up for avoidance when we're deliberately not responding to their cues. A while ago, maybe a year or two ago now, I had a colleague working with a vulnerable mum who had just come back from a paediatrician's appointment, and she was told by the paediatrician that her 8-week-old was playing her and did not need to be feeding that much. And stop feeding your baby when they cry and tell you they're hungry, and get them onto scheduled feeding every two hours. You've got to get this baby working for you. And these principles, and there are times some of these principles may be necessary in terms of being able to function in that particular system, and with the supports that a family have around them. Historically, we would have had family units of 20 to 40 people if you went back 1,000 years, and now we have more and more single parent households. We've gone from having access to, at any time, probably 5 adults who were chomping at the bit to say, give me the baby, I want some time with the baby. 5 people who want access to every baby that's out there, to now having 5 babies to 1 caregiver in a childcare setting. So the pressure and responsiveness is something that we're struggling with. more than what we were dealing with before in terms of capacity to respond and be responsive to needs. But it's when we step back from emotions that it seems to have as long as our needs are being met, even if not in response to our cues. But it's when we step back from emotions, we say, "Don't bring your feelings to me," that we tend to see the greatest impact on attachment style. And an example of this was at a park one day with my son, and a little guy, maybe 3 or 4 years old, ran past and tripped over and smacked his mouth on a steel bench. And I was ready to jump in there, but Dad was nearby and jumped in real quick and said, "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." And this kid looked up at him and looked stunned, and he turned around to his mate and said, "See, getting quick enough, and they don't even realise they're hurt." And this little child was learning at that moment that you need to be okay, because your vulnerability makes me feel out of control, and I need you to be okay for me. And this kid, got up and pretty much walked it off, a few tears, but didn't show that he was in pain or that he was crying, because he couldn't. And there are so many kids out there from families who might be not considered at risk, maybe considered really highly functioning in terms of their contribution to the economy, in terms of their careers, who are teaching kids that they cannot bring their emotions to them. Don't bring your feelings to me. You're okay. Come on, you're okay. You're okay. Come on, you're okay. We don't show feelings around here. And when you disconnect, when you don't show how you're feeling, and often parents think this is about building resilience. But what it is, it's you're not teaching them how to manage feelings. You're teaching them not to feel. And our face. Steve Porges says that we wear our heart on our face. Our heart and our internal emotional state is linked directly to the muscles of the face via the vagus nerve. And when you try to look like you're okay, you have to step away from how you're feeling. And you cannot selectively mute emotions. When you step away from sadness, anger, anxiety, worry, fear, you actually start to increasingly numb your opportunities for happiness and joy and other experiences related to connection. So we're teaching people not to feel, and generally they'll have less understanding of why they feel the way that they do, and less ability to regulate their emotions when we don't create a space for it. And on the most extreme end, we teach people that that bringing your negative emotions to others means rejection, and that if you want to stay connected, you need to put on a happy face and you need to be okay. And on the most extreme ends, I've sat with adults and men particularly who are often socialized in their other relationships not to express their vulnerability. I've had men sit across from me who've had these attachment experiences, once we get there and explore what their childhood's like and who they could go to when under stress, but who've sat across from me and said, I don't know why, but suicide feels like an easier option than telling people I'm not okay, that I'm struggling. That's how kind of deeply encoded how deep these neural pathways are in the brain, that going to people and saying I'm not okay is just not an option. We'll have a look at avoidant attachment.
To the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, but the point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure attachment?
Yes, insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her and the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem.
Questions come through: if a child experiences all the way to teenage years, can it be turned around and attachment be formed again? Yes, it can, even within the context of that relationship. Our attachment style is relationship specific. Generally, though, our attachment to our primary caregiver has the greatest impact on our general attachment template, and particularly if we have had horrible attachment experiences with a number of people. We are more likely to struggle to change that template. That can become our template for humans. The kids I've worked with who have grown up in houses that were functioning as meth labs, where a little guy I could think of, there's so much. People were giant spiders as far as he was concerned, and it took a lot. It takes a lot of work to change someone's attachment experiences around. But in terms of, there are so many people out there that you may know in a community or in a relationship who have had horrible attachment experiences, but then within an adult romantic relationship, if they find someone who is reliable, predictable, responsive, and nurturing, they can heal and learn to trust people again and have secure attachment relationships. The most important principle for breaking the cycle of intergenerational patterns of attachment is self-awareness. And if I had more time, we'd talk a bit more. I'd talk a bit more about a coherent narrative, but basically, it doesn't matter what you've been through as long as you've made sense of it. This is why counselling can be such a wonderful experience, because it doesn't matter what you've been through, as long as you understand why you feel the way you do in relation to the past is the greatest predictor of whether your child will have a secure attachment to you. And if you don't have a coherent story, it's very likely that the trauma and experiences you've had in the past are playing out in your current relationship with children without you knowing. So being able to explore and form a coherent story where you understand what you've been through, doesn't matter what you've been through, as long as you've made sense of it, is the greatest predictor. 85% correlation with secure attachment. If you have a coherent narrative and are aware of why you feel the way you do. Last attachment style, we're gonna go a little bit into question time because I haven't even got strategies. Last attachment style, disorganized attachment. But certainly built everything we're going to talk about will come back together. Disorganized attachment is so generally we see about 60% of population secure attachment, about 15% ambivalent, 15% avoidant, give or take a few percent, a few differences across cultures. Some are more avoidant, some more likely to be ambivalent. But generally we see 5 to 10%, depending on how a community is going, disorganized attachment. Now, disorganized attachment develops from an instinctual paradox, okay? Two instincts that normally work beautifully together are pushed into opposition. So every one of us out there was born with an instinct here in your brainstem to run away from danger, okay? This part of the brain, scary animal over there, run away from it. Every one of us was born with an instinct to run towards our caregiver, okay? Scary animal over there, run away from it, okay? Run towards my caregiver. Works beautifully together. What happens though if your caregiver is the source of danger, okay? That's when these instincts that work beautifully together are suddenly pushed into competition, this instinctual paradox. You are out of control. I need to get away from you. This part of my brain says you're under threat. Where are you going to go? You need to get to your caregiver, okay? You can't even calm yourself down without them. Where are you going to go? You need to go to them. But now you're hurting me. I really need to get away from you. You're terrifying me. You're screaming in my face. You've lost control and you're hurting me. I need to get away from you. But the further I get away from you, the more risk of abandonment I am and death. So I'm stuck in this irreconcilable loop because I'm critically dependent on you and you're a threat. And this seems to have its greatest impact. The earlier we are, younger we are developmentally, the greater the impact. we can only stay in this state for so long with these two competing instincts before we'll start to see dissociation occurring, allowing both instincts to be expressed at the same time. And these are the kids I worked with in Resi, who would scream at me, "F off," in my face. And I go, okay, I'm going. And I'd start to walk down the hall, and they'd follow me down the hall. I'm like, dude, I'm trying to F off. Like, what's happening right now? Why are you following me? And with the most complex children I've worked with, literally begging me to come back. And then wanting to assault me every time we get close. These are the kids who you might have a moment where you feel like you're finally kind of getting through and building a relationship. I remember in Resi, sitting on the couch, and they'd put their head on my shoulder, and I'd go, "Oh, we're getting there," and then out of nowhere they'd turn and just bite me, and I'd think, what was that about? Was that all a plan to make me vulnerable? No, it's about two parts of their brain and a cortex, a thinking brain that's not very well connected to them. And this part of the brain saying, you need connection, you want to depend, you want proximity, you can't manage these feelings on your own. And this part of the brain saying, what are you doing? This is the most dangerous time. And it's often when these kids flip their lid, they will seek you out and try to step away from you at the same time. And they call it disorganized attachment because there's no organized pathway. Secure attachment, you just directly cue people, okay? When you have a need, you say, hey, can I have a hug? Ambivalent, they're more likely to find a way to get in control of you. Avoidant, they'll step back and do whatever they can not to depend on you. And disorganized attachment, you'll see both coming and going at the same time. Come here, go away. Last slide is just around intersubjective experience before we move into strategies. It's about intersubjective experience. When you think about what's happening right now in this picture, besides clearly a Johnson & Johnson's commercial, what we're seeing is something that we're seeing, beautiful connection. You couldn't get any closer than that. The noses will not squish any further. We're seeing this beautiful skin-on-skin contact and beautiful mirroring, but we're also seeing what Dan Hughes refers to as intersubjective experience, the way we feel about ourselves in light of someone else's gaze. And I want you to think about how this little guy is feeling right now in light of his parents' gaze. He's learning through this moment that he is delightful. He's saying, wow, I'm a delightful little thing. I'm amazing. You just can't get enough of me. And mum is getting to feel the exact same thing, that she's delightful, that she's amazing, that she's the only one in the world. This intersubjective experience, assuming that mum has lots of support around her and not too much stress on her plate, she's probably having these little moments of delighting in her baby all the time, where he gets to feel delightful and is learning. His self-concept is emerging, and the brain is going through its most major stage of development. We're talking 2 million brain cells per second, and this little kid's brain is developing around the concept that he is good and that he is wonderful. I want you to think about how often would this kind of beautiful moments of delight be occurring if mum had severe postnatal depression and no support around her whatsoever. And let's say she's also got a baby with a really difficult temperament who is almost impossible to soothe. And maybe we'll throw in some domestic violence and the threat of homelessness and mum's own intergenerational trauma and maybe a drug addiction. And let's put baby really far along the spectrum with autism, where his social engagement system isn't switching on and he's not smiling back. He's just kind of staring through mum. And suddenly this natural experience that would happen quite regularly in a day, by no fault of mum's own or the baby's own, simply as a reflection of the trauma and different environmental factors that they've both been exposed to. This opportunity to delight and for this baby to learn that they're good has been completely removed. And how we likely look at a baby when we are completely overwhelmed and not able to and not coping. maybe with sadness, anxiety, anger, maybe even disgust. If we're not self-aware, we're low in empathy. And instead of a baby learning they're delightful, that they learn that they are horrible. And both of the children I just talked about, you know, the one on one end of the spectrum who's had perfect kind of developmental conditions, and the most horrific or stressful, both of those kids will have very different intersubjective experiences, and one will learn that they are delightful, and one will learn that they are horrible and not worthy of love and care. And both of them will take that into their relationships with you. And if you're out there in a daycare centre, you know, kid on this end of the spectrum are the one, they don't walk into the room, they skip into the room. Because when you feel delightful, you tend to behave delightfully. And everyone's just going to grin at them because they just think that they're wonderful. And they'll say, hey, good morning, how are you? How are you? I missed you. I haven't seen you since last Friday. And child number two, they won't skip in. They won't walk in. They'll stomp in, and they'll be feeling horrible. When you feel, when people look at you like crap, you tend to feel like crap and behave like crap. If we're not aware, we don't have a good framework, and we have a child who is pushing our buttons and treating people horribly, we might not even thinking. Even, you know, the amount of times I've worked with childcare centres, it's not even a conscious decision. They hear that kid wandering, they hear their voice coming down the path, and their stomach tightens, and they go, oh shit, it's Tuesday, here we go. And they might say, hey, now before you even come in, okay, are we going to have the same day we had yesterday? And throw a little bit of shame and rejection at them before they even get in the door. And the child who gets delighted in gets to feel delightful in light of your gaze. And we're seeing a little bit of a cycle forming. I feel delightful, so I behave delightfully. So you look at me with delight, and we get a bit of a cycle. And a child who feels horrible comes in behaving horribly. We look at them like they're horrible, and they get to feel horrible in light of our gaze. So you're getting a bit of an idea of a strategy that we're going to talk about in a second. So moving into strategies. First one, competence as opposed to compliance. Okay, really important, based on the principle that children do well if they can, rather than children do well if they want to. Competence believes that we need to help the kids trust and build the skills required to behave. It recognises that children who have poor impulse control and who struggle to manage their emotions, who feel angry all the time and do not trust and feel safe handing over control to people, have skill deficits and are unable to trust. And we need to focus on building those skills rather than coercing them into behaving. If you give a child a meaningful consequence twice and you don't see a shift in behavior, if you give them a meaningful consequence twice and you don't see a shift in behavior, we're talking, we can be pretty confident it's about can't rather than won't. Okay, that they lack the skills to do it rather than they're choosing not to. And we have some really, you know, traditionally our education system is very compliance focused. Children simply choose to behave or not to behave, and if they don't do what we say, then they go to detention. And after, if that doesn't work, then we suspend them, and if that doesn't work, after a number of suspensions, we exclude them. Next school, start again. And it's based on the idea that these kids are actually sitting there going, oh, I just wish a teacher would yell at me right now. I have never, every time I've done training with a school, and I said, so when you move from detention to suspension, has that ever worked? Has that ever changed a child's behaviour? Now, I do recognise that we've got to keep kids safe, and we have a responsibility to keep the other children in our community safe, and that everyone has expectations that kids will be separated if they're harming other people, in terms of keeping people safe. But what I'm saying is that if you put a kid in detention and get them to write out lines, I will keep my hands to myself. I still see this happening. After an hour of writing that out, they will not have more empathy. They will not have better impulse control. They will not have better perspective taking, problem solving, capacity to self-regulate. They will have slightly better handwriting. And moving from compliance to competence. The greatest example I've seen in the education system are schools that have replaced detention with meditation, that have moved from detention to mindfulness training. And they don't even need to use it as a punishment or as say it's a consequence, but say, hey, this is a skill that you need to work on, that you need to build on. You know, we still need to work on managing our emotions, because I want you to be able to participate in class, and I want you to be able to be safe with the other kids, and not disrupt them, and be able to have fun. So we've got to work on how we manage our emotions, and that means that after class we need to sit back for 10 minutes and we're going to do a little mindfulness exercise together, and then you and me are going to do a little role play. You can make it fun. We're going to do a little role play around what we could do differently when we have those feelings come up, and let's practice. I'll have a go at being you, and you can be me as a teacher, and then we'll swap. You do that for 10 minutes. And it's worth its weight in gold. It's going to be far more meaningful than taking a star off the wall, or removing a privilege, or making them stay back and pick up rubbish. It's not going to build that skill, and that's what competence is about. That we see it as skill deficits, and we communicate that to the child. And I'll talk about that in a second with the PACE model. Brainstem interventions. This is about supporting some of the things we can do directly to help children stay regulated, but also to repair their brainstem over time. And we can do this despite the fact that we can have all sorts of horrible associations made in our brainstem due to trauma. We can actually tap into some positive associations that all of us are born with, based on some in utero experiences. Now, this might seem, people who are hearing this for the first time, it might sound a little bit out there, a little bit crazy even. The idea that we are carrying around positive associations from our in utero experiences. But every single one of us, believe it or not, was once in the womb. Okay, it's been a long time for some of us, and during that time, scientists believe that it's a pretty beautiful place to be. We are completely contained, safe, and satiated. You know, we're floating around in this perfectly regulated state. So before you were born, you had never been hungry, and some of you might be feeling peckish right now, okay? You'd never been hot or cold, always kept at perfect bath temperature. There you were, just floating around in your own little private day spa float tank. Didn't even have to breathe. How lazy is that, okay? All the while, this constant neural input, patterned repetitive activity, this constant input of the mother's heartbeat, this audio and tactile experience we hear, feel all around us, and neurons that fire together wire together. And we see this pattern of neural activity becomes associated with safety and containment. And we know this because every single culture all around the world, without fail, has virtually identical practices for calming down babies. What do we do? What do we do? We hold them, we rock them, we pat them on the back. How many of you in the early education get kids to sleep, patting them on the back, rock them, making utero sounds, swaddle them, wrap them up tight, hug them. All of these things are tapping into neural experiences. But you'll notice that very intuitively, we will naturally rock babies at resting heartbeat rhythms, around 80 beats per minute, or sub-rhythms of 60 or 40 beats per minute. Right now, if something happened to overwhelm your capacity, to traumatize you, it's very likely that you would curl into what position? The fetal position, and gently rock your cerebellum back and forward at your mother's resting heartbeat. Okay, crazy. This doesn't just work for calming down babies, it works all the way throughout the lifespan. Patterned repetitive activity at heartbeat rhythms, rhythmic repetitive activity soothes our brainstem and tells us to bring back on our social engagement system, that we can switch off our defensive fight-flight system and bring our relationship and social engagement brain back online, where we're ready for language, past, future thinking, problem solving, rather than vigilance on edge, defensive states. Where it gets really interesting is the research that has been going on for a good 20 years now at the Child Trauma Academy in Texas, with Bruce Perry, who many of you have heard about as a senior fellow, where they found that not only does this pattern repetitive activity calm the brain in the moment, it actually repairs the brainstem over time. That dancing, drumming, music, and most powerful of all, patterned massage, all have a really, really positive impact on the brain, and that the more time we spend in a regulated state, the more likely we are to move into a regulated trait. Just like when you're in a threatened state over time, our brain can reset our baseline up to an anxious, threatened, hypervigilant state, where you're constantly in a hypervigilant state, hypervigilant trait virtually. The same thing happens, engaging in dancing, drumming, marching, horse riding, pattern massage, trampolining, martial arts, where there's a focus on rhythm and discipline and patterned activity. All of these things calm the brain over time, but actually repair the brainstem over an extended period of time. So you can use this pattern repetitive activity as a transitional beam. I've used it for kids to enter the classroom. I've used it as a way to get kids to engage in therapy using music or movement or walking and singing. We can learn with rhythmic activity, but you can also use it by integrating it into their week, swimming twice a week and dancing twice a week, and throw in a bit of drumming here and there. You can actually use it to repair their brainstem. It's a great way to use it as a transitional activity coming into the room at the beginning of the day, to use some rhythmic movement, get everyone moving, doing activities together, marching or running as fast as they can, and then slowing it down and then moving to a beat. Good way to switch their defensive systems off and get their thinking brain back online. Mindfulness, really quickly. I'm sure everyone has heard of mindfulness now. Some people are just overhearing about mindfulness because we've heard so much about it. It's a really, really powerful strategy in terms of repairing the brain. Know that kids who have experienced trauma may struggle with it. And I recommend things like mindful movements. Thich Nhat Hanh's mindful movements. I can send you guys a link to that when we send out the slides. Thich Nhat Hanh's mindful movements is a good one. Breathing in and down. And in and out. So moving in line with our breath is a good introduction for children who, being really still and engaging in some traditional mindfulness practices, that focus on what's happening inside the body, can be quite stressful, and certainly for kids who are more dissociative, who've experienced trauma and seem like they're not really there, it can be quite triggering. The question, is there a resource to find particular music? If you Google mindfulness, there are a billion apps. You go on YouTube. New Horizons is one that I like. They have heaps of different sleep meditations. I like using sleep meditations for my own little boy, and heaps of different kids guided meditations that involve aspects of fantasy that aren't bringing too much awareness to the body, but just notice be cautious around how kids respond to that, and some of them just really struggle to sit still. The moment that they are still, their brain says, "Are we trapped? Are we in danger?" And can move them into quite a reactive state. But if you search Thich Nhat Hanh, THICHNHAT, HAHN, Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who created something called the Plum Village in France. It was a trauma sanctuary, and he's created something called mindful movements, 10 mindful movements. If you search that to 10 mindful movements in YouTube, you'll see a clip of that, and he's got a little book and thing to accompany it that you can use with kids. But there are so many. Smiling Minds is a great one for kids. Sitting Still Like a Frog is one of my favorites, and I'll send you guys a link to download Sitting Still Like a Frog, the little tracks. It's a wonderful one for building skills. Build self-awareness, impulse control, empathy. It's the only way to develop empathy other than through experiencing mirroring that I'm aware of. I'm trying to rush through these strategies at the end, but I know we're going over, and I want to make some time for questions. The last thing I want to talk about is Dean Hughes' dyadic developmental principles. So Dean Hughes developed a form of therapy that involves working with the parent and child together, but his principles for facilitating attachment are incredibly powerful and useful. And I think that they are universal principles for working with children, facilitating relationships, but they are so important in children who have missed out on early developmental experiences. Children who have missed out on these normal nurturing experiences, it's fundamental that they get them in their relationships with us. And right now, around you guys in Whittlesea, there are babies' brains who are developing. I'll send out a link for Thich Nhat Hanh. I just saw a question come through again. I'll send out a link to that with the slides. Right now, around you guys in Whittlesea and around me in Brisbane, there are babies out there whose brains are developing at the most insane rate, and a large majority of them, their brains are developing around almost constant stimulation interaction with a safe and soothing caregiver who just cannot get enough of them. And at the same time, right now, around you in Whittlesea, around me in Brisbane, there are babies right now whose brains are developing around the ceiling, who are lying on their back for long periods of time with virtually no interaction, complete relational neglect, whole trees of neurons just going into atrophy. They have missed out on the nurturing, the playfulness, the regulating, physical, nurturing touch that is fundamental to our development and our sense of safety and our ability to self-regulate. And it's so important that when we are supporting children who have missed out on these nurturing experiences, that we find ways to give them the developmental experiences they missed out on. We do not develop as a function of time. If you put a child in a room and you push food under the door and they live to age 10, you will have a baby's brain in a 10-year-old's body. They will not have any of the skills or capacities of a 10-year-old. Okay, it's only through having the right developmental experiences. And too often I hear people still saying, act your age, come on, you're 4, you need to, or you're 5, you're 6, you're 7, you need to act like a 10-year-old. When they missed out on those years of interactions, they were plonked in front of the TV, people barely paying attention to them. No one was interacting. Their lives weren't rich in language and social cues, and they weren't being supported to calm down. They weren't being mirrored and learning to resonate with the emotions of others. So PACE model is really important. Playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy is the last thing that I want to talk about, and is fundamental. It's fundamental to facilitating attachment in traumatized children. When we are playful, okay, playfulness is incompatible with shame, and kids can talk about all sorts of things when we are being playful. Sorry, I just had another quick question. So just around consistency, around strategies that we've said to avoid. I'm not sure what strategies they are, but I'll come back to that when we get to questions. And if you could provide some extra context, that'd be great. Playfulness. This is the last thing we feel like doing with a child who is pushing our buttons. It does feel counterintuitive. Generally, the kids that you are holding in mind when you signed up for this training are likely to be kids who are causing you stress, whose behaviours are challenging for one reason or another. And generally when we're stressed, our response tends to be to bring a serious voice. In fact, whenever we want to talk about something serious with a child in terms of modifying their behaviour, we generally bring our serious voice. I want you to think about right now, if the person who is in some position of authority to you, maybe the director of your organisation or CEO, someone in a position of authority came into the room where you are right now and said, right, we need to talk right now. I guarantee you blood would rush from your prefrontal cortex straight away as your brain prepared for threat, not social engagement. And they said, now what happened yesterday? And I guarantee you would not be able to work out what day it is. So you'd be like, yesterday, what day is it? I don't know. Because your brain is becoming geared towards threat, not relationships. And we do this to kids all the time. Why did you do that? Do you think it's okay to do that? And we wonder why they say, I don't know. They just can't access that information. As soon as we do it, we start moving them into a defensive state. And if we do the opposite and we use a playful tone, we use a regulating tone, the same tone of voice you use to read stories to kids and to say, good morning, everyone. Every teacher in the world intuitively knows to go, good morning, everyone, because as soon as you bring prosody into your voice, their ears have to track that, okay? And when the muscles of the ears start tracking the human voice, it tells us to bring on our social engagement system. When if we use a voice like this, it says that we're starting to move our voice into the spectrum of sound associated with danger. We start to increase stress levels. So being playful, using physical touch to express care, if you've got the relationship, putting your arm around them, you would be blown away about what kids can talk about and reflect on when you are not increasing shame. Kids who have experienced trauma generally have not had a template for rupture and repair where someone says, hey, you can't do that. But hey, come here, I still love you. It's still okay. They haven't had temporary shame followed by a reunion. They've had violence and contempt. Someone saying, get out of here, I don't want to see you. And maybe waiting 2 days before it's safe to come back and connect with the person. Acceptance. This is about communicating connection. It's about communicating unconditional positive regard. Okay, so acceptance is about saying, I know you don't want to behave this way. It's not your fault you behave this way, but it's your responsibility. Okay, it's not your fault that when I say no to you, you see red and you feel so angry. Okay, it's not your fault that you have these big emotions. It's not your fault that whenever you get close to people, you need to control them and you can't handle them. You really struggle with me going home at the end of the day. It's not your fault you feel that way, but it's your responsibility. Okay, and this behavior is having an impact on other people, so we've got to work on it together. Okay, we're going to lift all the shame off, but keep the responsibility. You've got to work on it, okay? And it's important that we work on it because I want you to have good relationships. I want you to have good friends. I want you to do well because I care about you. And communicating, using those words, because I care about you. You back up every single boundary and expectation with because I care about you, and you will see their resistance starts to falter. It's hard. It's so easy to push back when I say because I said so, or because it's not okay to treat people like that, and because it's not okay to talk to me like that. Oh, I can fight that. But when we say, hey, we've got to work on this, because I really want you to be able to have good friends, and I want you to be able to play at lunchtime without being supervised by a teacher, because I care about you. Okay. Well, we've really got to work on how we manage when we get upset, how we manage that we don't end up putting holes in the wall, and that we learn to fix them and take responsibility. Because the idea of you turning 18 and heading out there into the world, you know, the idea of you getting blacklisted and ending up homeless because you smashed up a place, that makes me feel sick in the stomach. I'm not okay with that. I care about you too much. We got to work on this, and I'm going to harass you to work on this. Every day we're going to do a little bit of practicing on how we calm down and how we manage our feelings, because you deserve to have a nice house, or you deserve to have good friends, and I care about you. Okay, we know this is about what's happened to you, but it's still your responsibility. When you communicate that, it takes the shame off, and kids start to invest. They want to learn skills when it's not a punishment, when we see them as doing the best that they can with what they've experienced, or with their skill deficits that they have. Curiosity opposed to criticism. I wonder what it is about this particular thing. When you're curious, when you sit in parallel to a child, when you want to explore their behavior, never sit face to face in front of them. Okay, it's too intimate to talk about when we're talking about things that elicit shame. Side by side, going for a walk, put your arm around them and sit down next to them. Put your arm around them and say, or stand next to them and look out the window and say, now what is it about Wednesday mornings? Tuesday mornings you come in, big high five for me. Wednesday mornings, oh, you just seem so angry. I wonder what it is about Wednesday. Or I wonder why it is whenever you play soccer, you end up kicking the ball into the bushes and pushing someone over. I wonder what that's about. I wonder if it's when you start running about that maybe you get a bit excited. Maybe your body starts to think that you're in danger, or maybe you feel angry, or maybe we've got to practice doing this. I wonder what it is. When you're curious, you'd be blown away about what comes out. Or I wonder why whenever I go to give attention to the other kids, this is what happens. I wonder what it's about. When you're curious, kids will be able to communicate and talk about it completely different to saying why. As soon as we communicate judgment or evaluation, we lose them and we move them into a defensive state. And the last one is about empathy. Okay, reflecting back in real time their emotions. So when I talk about empathy, I'm not talking about just understanding where they're coming from, like I was talking about acceptance. With empathy, I'm talking about mirroring and reflecting back their feelings in real time. This is where we develop empathy in the first place. It's actually when a baby smiles at us and we smile back at them, they grin. When a baby expresses sadness and we go, oh, and we reflect back their sadness in real time, that's actually when we start to wire our internal experience with the outward expression of others. And according to researcher named Stern, this happens at least once a minute. Whenever we're with a baby, it's so dynamic. It's almost happening every second. It's so important that we understand that if you do not have these experiences, you do not develop empathy. And the greatest example of this historically has been the Romanian orphanages, where we saw that children had virtually no contact with people other than being fed and changed. And the ones that survived just felt no guilt or remorse. They didn't resonate with the emotions of others. Many of these children who were adopted out all over the Western world just weren't connected to the emotions of other people as a result of this. And we now know that it's through mirroring that you are able to become wired to others. And one of the things that is so amazing about this process is, one, when you reflect back someone's feelings in real time, they can tolerate a lot more frustration. And generally, most of us are good at doing it with happiness. Kids smiling, having fun, we grin with them. Sadness, most of us are comfortable doing that. If we're comfortable with vulnerability, some of us aren't, if people haven't really reflected back our vulnerability, and we're more on the avoid end of the spectrum. But generally, we can go, oh, you really miss your mummy. You're really missing mum again today. But, you know, if we've got a kid who's struggling with separation anxiety, we might get a bit fatigued over time and go, come on, you know, they're coming back, come on. But we know when we step into that emotion with them, we get down into that emotion with them and go, oh, you're really missing them. When we climb down there with them and they feel like they're not alone in it, it's so much easier to bring them back across that bridge when we've connected right brain to right brain in terms of that empathy. But it's where, with anger, that we normally get stuck. And this is the one where it's most powerful. You can maintain your boundary and say, no, I'm not going to allow you to do that. It's not safe. But still reflect back that anger and say, oh, but you're feeling so frustrated and you feel like I'm being mean. You're really, really angry right now. And I'm sorry that you feel like that. But I'm telling you, I care about you, and it's not safe to do it. But I can hear that you're feeling like I'm being mean. It's hard to escalate when you're getting empathy in real time. It is my number one tool for calming down people who are angry and in an out of control state, is to give them real time feedback and say, I can see you are feeling so frustrated right now. And it works really well for kids, and you'd be surprised at how often I was at a childcare centre in west of Cairns one day in Atherton, and there was a little girl who had just got to the door and been reminded by the early educator that her hat was on the other side of the room and she needed a hat before she could go out to play, and she dropped to the ground and started bawling. And the educator had a big day, and we'd just had a workshop the night before, and she was like, she wasn't really using the strategy at all. There was no empathy, and she was like, hey, I can stand here all day. And I was over the other side of the room doing some stuff, and after 2 minutes this little girl was still crying, and she was still standing there, and I came over and said, now could be one of those times to try that empathy. And she was like, remind me. And I talked her through it, and she stepped back over and said, and barely even, she didn't climb down in there, she barely dipped her toe and said, you really don't want to get your hat, do you? And the little girl stopped crying, said, no, I don't, and got up and walked over and got her hat. And that lady was sold from that moment. She couldn't believe it. That was enough. The little girl walked over, picked up her hat, went out. She needed someone just to be there with her just a tiny bit, and that was enough for her. So it's a really, really powerful strategy depending on the context. Now, I realise we are well and truly over time, and we've gone into our question time. So my apologies for that. I can go off on tangents and can be pretty bad at sticking with time. But I wanted to I'm happy to go over another 10 to answer any more questions that have come up. I see there's a few little comments that have come up. One from Dale: Indigenous music often has a calming rhythm like the heartbeat of a person. Most definitely. And using rhythm sticks also in terms of breathing, if it's appropriate and culturally appropriate for the child to be playing instruments, wind instruments like the didgeridoo, we know that long outward breaths is incredibly regulating. So another just regulating activity in general is to shorten the inward breath and a longer outward breath. Every time you breathe in, your heart rate goes up a bit, and every time you breathe out, your heart rate comes down a bit. It's called sinus arrhythmia. Okay, our heart rate is constantly going up and down. And if you take big inward breaths and short outward breaths, your heart rate will spike really, really quickly, and tell your brain via the vagus nerve that you're in danger. But if you do shorter inward breaths and longer outward breaths, it actually tells your brain to calm down. And when that sigh I was talking about, when we go, when you yawn, it tells your brain to calm down. When you sing, it tells your brain to calm down. And there is no shorter inward and longer outward breath that I'm aware of than the circular breathing required to play instruments like the didgeridoo. Very small inward breath, very long outward breath, and helps to explain why I can kind of help them move into a meditative state. So definitely, if you can connect them to culture, and you know what's really important to understand is that there are so many aspects of culture all around the world, you know, that involve rhythm and movement. That is why we've been able to, you know, cultures all around the world have been able to survive traumas on a massive scale, you know, war and famine and rape and murder on a massive scale. And then you also, you know, it's also supportive to understand why in Australia, where we separated so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from the cultural principles that they would have used to heal, why is just one of the many reasons that intergenerational trauma has been exacerbated, because we've separated from the principles and experiences that would have helped them as a community to heal. So there was another question that came through around family using consequences, whether it works or not, and want educators to do this at kindy when you know the child won't respond. I think one of the easiest ways to explain is that we want to make sure that any consequence we use is building skills. That consequences don't necessarily need to be negative either, and parents can take a while to come on board with it. But I think when you say the fact that we've used this consequence before, or that you're using this consequence consistently and the behavior still there, tells us that there might be some skills that we want to focus on, and that's where we want to focus our attention on building skills. We're going to hold the boundary with the child, and if they're doing something that they're not able to do, we're going to interrupt their play. We're going to bring them, but we want to focus on them learning to calm down with our support, getting better at calming down and self-regulating rather than trying to coerce them into doing things. And you know, an example I use when I'm working with residential care programs is really the kids that I see in detention, where you can get them to toe the line with punishment and consequences. You know, when you control their whole environment, kids will often focus all their attention on complying and behaving, but that's not real change. You know, in detention center, if you say to a kid, you need to get in youth detention in prison facilities, you say, hey, you know, if you talk back to me again, you're not going to get 3 gold stars, and there'll be no stereo in your room tonight, or no TV in your room, or you get in the classroom, I'm going to flip you and put you back in the cell for the rest of the day. These kids start to toe the line, but what we see is it's all really an illusion. It's coerced compliance, and the moment that they're out of detention and with someone more vulnerable, those behaviours are still there. They haven't got better at managing impulses. They're not any higher in empathy. So people suggesting tummy breathing regularly throughout the day to keep calmness. You can do dragon breathing. I like hot chocolate breathing as well, is a good one. Pretending to cool down your hot chocolate. My favorite actually is to use a calm down jar. So you can get a glitter jar. A jar, basically, it's a sometimes called a mindfulness jar, or a glitter jar, or a calm down jar. Plastic jar. Never hand a glass jar to an angry kid. Vegemite, peanut butter. Clean it out, take off the label, fill it with water, a bit of a thickening agent. You can use corn syrup or other thickening agents, a bit of gelatine, with tiny bit of warm water, and then you add glitter for thoughts and feelings. You can add some little glitter stars and put a lid on it and glue the lid on if you want. And when they're angry, give it a shake little expression of anger. This is one of Thich Nhat Hanh's. It's taken from Thich Nhat Hanh exercise. Give it a little shake. Suddenly all our thoughts and feelings are swirling around in front of us. We put it down in front of us, and then we watch thoughts and feelings flying around in front of us while we do our long outward breaths, our dragon breathing or our hot chocolate breathing. We pretend we're blowing out candles. We can blow a pinwheel. We can blow bubbles. And we watch as our thoughts and feelings all start to slow down in front of us. And we wait, we keep breathing until they get to the bottom. And by then we'll notice that all our thoughts and feelings have stopped swirling around in our head, and we're ready to come back in and engage or play. Other points there, some people to be aware it's not culturally appropriate, as I said, whether it's culturally appropriate or not, for young girls and women to play the didgeridoo. Important to note that, and there might be other activities that they can do that are culturally appropriate, and or just other mindfulness activities. But I think in many First Nations communities, the concept of Didiri, deep listening and connection, doing mindfulness of sounds, or just being out in nature and noticing where we're at. Every single culture around the world has some golden wisdom tradition that involves quietening the mind and bringing our awareness to the present with purpose. And whether it's contemplative prayer, listening to God, listening to the universe, connecting with country, yoga, all sorts of things. I realise that we probably have to go with that. Was there any last questions from people before we finish up? The question: am I available to present to school staff in Victorian schools? Yeah, I have done most of my work in Victoria has been more around early education. I certainly do a lot of work with schools up here in Queensland, and we're not travelling to Victoria currently, but certainly available to do webinars, do lots of trainings with school teachers. Last thing, just to let you know about in terms of other people being able to access this information. Over the last 3 years, I've been very, very slowly filming parts of my workshops and editing them with slides popping up and little pictures and stuff popping up. And I've edited it into a 6-hour trauma and attachment workshop, all broken into 20-minute modules, and it's taken me so long to do it that I had hair for the actual beginning of it before I shaved my head off. But I think it's been a slow process because it's been something that's always been on the back burner, and a lot of the work that we do is kind of crisis work. But it's up and it's available, and I'll be sending out a discount code. It's normally $180 to be able to access it. You can watch the videos at your own pace. I think you have 3-month access to it. And it's the content that we've covered, but a lot more because it's spaced out over 6 hours. But this is really a condensed version of that training. So this one will also be available, I think, for other people who've registered over the next 24 hours for people to access that. But I'm also happy for you to share the link to people to have a look at that as well. But if they're registered, we'll be able to send through the slides. I'll send through a link to the training and also some other resources that we made reference to as well. So sounds like we've got to end it there. But thank you everyone for taking some time out to participate. Sorry about some of the kind of technical issues there with the sound and stuff. I'm still kind of learning how to navigate the whole webinar world. But I hope this has been helpful. And thanks again to the Whittlesea Council, the early education guys there for helping to moderate today and for putting today on. So thanks a lot, guys, and take care.